Before we begin, comment below, which city are you watching from, and what time is it there now? In September 1897, in the quiet mountains of rural Pennsylvania, a man returned. He had been missing for 13 days. When he came back, he was barefoot, his clothes torn, his eyes staring into space. He had no serious injuries. He didn't seem hungry, but something in him had changed, something no one could put their finger on. His name was Thomas Calloway, 32 years old, carpenter, father of 2 young children, respected member of the small community of Ashford Hollow, a village of less than 200 inhabitants nestled between dense forests and permanent fog. When asked where he had been, Thomas looked away. When pressed, he shook his head silently, and when the local pastor, Reverend William Hargrave, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "My son, God forgives everything. Just tell us what you saw," Thomas replied only this, "I can't, and you shouldn't know." He never spoke of those 13 days again. Ashford Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where doors were rarely locked, where children played freely in the clearings and men gathered on Saturdays to share firewood and stories. The village was almost 10 kilometers from the nearest town, connected only by a dirt road that became impassable in winter. Life there was simple, but not easy. Winters were long, the harvests were uncertain, and the surrounding forest, vast, ancient, indifferent, seemed to watch everything with patience. Thomas Calloway was born there. His family was well known. His father, Samuel Calloway, had been a blacksmith. His mother, Agnes, died of fever when he was only 9 years old. Thomas grew up helping his father in the workshop, learning to shape iron and wood with his hands. At 23, he married Elizabeth Mercer, the daughter of a local farmer. Together, they had 2 children, Mary, 6, and Peter, 4. Elizabeth was described in the records as a calm woman with a soft voice who tended the garden behind the house and taught the children to read using the family's old Bible. Thomas was a quiet, hard-working man of few words, but he was respected. He built fences, repaired roofs, and made custom furniture. His work was solid. His promises were kept. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in the records or accounts of the time to suggest instability. There were no debts. There were no public fights. There were no signs of despair. And yet, on a cold September morning, Thomas Calloway simply disappeared. It was September 6th, a Tuesday. The sun rose covered by a thin layer of fog, as was common at that time of year. Thomas woke up early, as usual. Elizabeth later reported that he had breakfast, black bread, butter, and strong tea. The children were still asleep. He said he was going to Jonathan Frost's property, about 2 miles away, to deliver an oak door he had ordered. Nothing unusual. Thomas made this trip often. He left around 6 in the morning and never arrived. Jonathan Frost waited all day. At dusk, he sent his eldest son, Samuel, to the Calloway's house to ask what had happened. Elizabeth turned pale. Thomas was not at home. He had not returned. At first, she thought he might have stopped in the village, perhaps helping someone, perhaps dealing with some unexpected event. But when night fell and Thomas still hadn't returned, fear began to squeeze her chest like an invisible hand. The next morning, a group of men formed, 12 volunteers, all armed with lanterns, ropes, and rifles. They searched the road between Thomas's house and the Frost property. Then they expanded their search to the side trails. Then into the forest. Nothing. No trace. No footprints off the path. No signs of a struggle. The oak door was found 3 days later, abandoned on the side of the road, halfway between the 2 properties. It was intact, simply left there, as if Thomas had decided to leave it and go in another direction. But where and why? In the county archives there is a curious record. A statement given by Margaret Hale, a resident of Ashford Hollow, on the 10th day of the search. She was a woman in her 60s, a widow who lived alone on the southern edge of the village. Margaret said the following: "The night before Thomas disappeared, I woke up to a sound. I can't say what it was. It sounded like footsteps, but they weren't normal footsteps. They were slow, very slow, as if someone were walking and stopping, walking and stopping. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything, just the fog, and that sound. I stayed awake until dawn. I couldn't sleep anymore. When asked if she thought the sound came from the forest, Margaret shook her head. No, it came from inside the village. This statement was filed away, but never investigated. On the 13th day, at dawn, Thomas Calloway appeared. He was standing in the middle of the main street in front of the church, barefoot, motionless, staring into nothingness. To understand what happened during those 13 days, we need to go back in time a little. We need to know who Thomas Calloway was before he disappeared, because something changed in him. And perhaps that change did not begin in the forest. Perhaps it began much earlier, quietly, inside his own home. Elizabeth Calloway kept a diary. It wasn't common among the women of Ashford Hollow, but Elizabeth had learned to write from her mother, who in turn had been taught by an aunt who had come from Boston. The diary was found years later, stored in a wooden box in the attic of the old Calloway house. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but still legible. And there, among notes about the weather, recipes, and short prayers, there was something else. In an entry dated 3 weeks before the disappearance, Elizabeth wrote, "Thomas doesn't sleep well. He wakes up in the middle of the night and sits on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. When I ask him what's wrong, he says it's just fatigue. But I know him. He's lying." 2 weeks later, another note. "He left before dawn today. He said he was going to chop wood, but when he came back, his hands were clean, no sawdust, no marks. I asked him where he had been. He smiled but didn't answer. That smile scared me." Thomas had always been a man of routine. He woke up with the first ray of sunshine. He worked until his body asked for rest. He came home, ate in silence, played briefly with his children before going to sleep. But in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, something in that routine began to crack. Small cracks, almost imperceptible. He started leaving earlier, coming back later. He would stare at the forest with an intensity that had not existed before. Margaret Hale, the same woman who reported the strange sounds the night before the disappearance, gave another statement that was never included in the official records. She said that about a month earlier, she saw Thomas standing at the edge of the forest at dusk, alone. He was not working. He was not hunting. He was just standing there, motionless, looking into the trees. Margaret called out to him, but Thomas did not respond. She called again, louder. This time, he turned his head slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. "It's all right, Miss Hale," he said in a low voice. "Just thinking." Margaret reported that it made her uneasy. It wasn't the way he spoke. It was as if he were far away, even though he was right there in front of me. Thomas's children also noticed something. Mary, the eldest, told a cousin years later that in the last few weeks before her father disappeared, he began waking her up in the middle of the night for no reason. She would open her eyes and see him sitting at the foot of her bed, silent, just staring. When she asked what was going on, Thomas said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. Mary didn't understand. "He seemed sad," she said, as if he were saying goodbye, but without saying goodbye. Elizabeth tried to talk to him. In the days leading up to his disappearance, she asked him directly if something was bothering him, if he had debts, if there were problems with a neighbor, if he was sick. Thomas denied everything. He said he was just tired, that the approaching winter made him pensive. Elizabeth believed him because she wanted to believe him, because it was easier to believe. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She wrote this in her diary. "I should have insisted. I should have asked more questions, but I was afraid of the answers." Jonathan Frost, the man who ordered the oak door, also gave a curious statement. He said that a few days before Thomas disappeared, they talked briefly when they met in the village. Jonathan asked how the work on the door was going. Thomas replied that it was almost ready. But then, for no apparent reason, he said something strange, something Jonathan couldn't forget. Thomas looked at him and said, "Sometimes I wonder if the things we build really matter. If anything we do stays, or if everything just disappears when we're not looking." Jonathan didn't know how to respond. He tried to laugh, thinking it was some kind of strange philosophy, but Thomas didn't laugh back. He just looked away and moved on. These small, fragmented details only began to make sense later, when Thomas returned, when it became clear that something had happened, something he knew but refused to share. Ashford Hollow was a close-knit community, but also a closed one. People lived close to each other, but they didn't always share everything. There were secrets. There always are. And maybe Thomas had his own. Maybe he had seen something, heard something, or felt something that others didn't. Or maybe he had simply reached a limit that no one around him could perceive. What we know for sure is that on the morning of September 6th, Thomas Calloway walked out the oak door, left his house, and never returned. What we also know is that on that same morning, the sky was grey, the fog was thick, and the forest around Ashford Hollow seemed quieter than usual, as if it were waiting. And on the 13th day, Thomas returned, but he did not return alone. He returned carrying something with him, something invisible but present, something that was in his eyes, in his silence, in his absolute refusal to speak. The morning of September 6th began like any other, but records from that time suggest that something in the air was different. Reverend William Hargrave noted in his personal diary that he woke up with a strange feeling that morning, an uncomfortable stillness, he wrote, as if the world were holding its breath. He did not know at that moment that Thomas Calloway had already left home. Elizabeth prepared breakfast before dawn. She reported that Thomas was quieter than usual. He ate slowly, chewing each piece of bread as if he needed to memorize the taste. She asked if he was okay. Thomas nodded, but did not look at her, only at the window, at the fog that covered everything outside. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and looked back at Elizabeth, at the house, at the children still sleeping in the next room. She said that for a moment she thought he was going to say something important, but he just took a deep breath, picked up the oak door leaning against the wall, and left. It was 6:15 in the morning. The sun had not yet fully risen. The road was covered with a thin layer of dew. The surrounding trees looked darker than usual, shrouded in fog that rose from the ground like smoke. Thomas followed his usual route. The road leading to Jonathan Frost's property was mostly straight, lined with tall pine trees on both sides. There was only one fork halfway along the route where a secondary trail led into the forest. Thomas knew that path by heart. He had traveled it dozens of times. But that morning, something happened. The last confirmed record of Thomas Calloway alive and in transit comes from Albert Finch, a farmer who lived on a small property about a kilometer from the Calloway home. Albert was outside feeding his chickens when he saw Thomas walking down the road, carrying the oak door on his shoulders. It was approximately 6:40 a.m. Albert waved. Thomas waved back, but didn't stop. Albert reported that he seemed hurried, but not in a rush. A strange description, but one that made sense to those who knew Thomas. He always moved with purpose, never running but never wasting time. And then, silence. No one else saw Thomas Calloway that morning. No one saw him arrive at Frost's property. No one saw him return. No one saw him enter the forest. But something happened, because the oak door was found 3 days later, abandoned on the side of the road, exactly at the point where the secondary trail branched off into the trees. The door was leaning against a log, intact, as if it had been carefully placed there. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no drag marks. There was no blood. Just the door, alone, waiting. The search began on the second day. 12 men entered the forest with flashlights, ropes, and guns. They shouted Thomas's name for hours. The echo faded among the trees without a response. They followed the secondary trail as far as it would take them, going almost 2 miles into the woods. The forest was dense, ancient, full of ravines and hidden streams. It was easy to get lost there, but Thomas knew that forest. He had hunted there since he was a child. If he had gotten lost, he would have marked the way. He would have left signs, but there was nothing. On the third day, the search expanded. More volunteers joined. Women prepared food for the men who returned exhausted at dusk. Elizabeth Calloway remained in the house with the children, waiting. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just waited, her hands clasped in her lap. staring at the front door. Margaret Hale visited every day, bringing bread and chicken broth. She said Elizabeth looked like a statue, as if she knew something terrible had happened, but couldn't quite accept it. On the 5th day, the rumors began. Someone suggested that Thomas might have run away, that maybe he had hidden debts, that maybe he had a mistress in another town, but no one who really knew Thomas believed that. Others suggested that he might have been attacked by an animal, a bear perhaps, or wolves, but there was no blood. There were no signs of violence, and animals would not have left the oak door carefully propped against a tree. On the 7th day, the search began to wind down. The men were tired. Families needed to get back to their lives. Life couldn't stop, even in the face of mystery. Some still went out alone, walking secondary trails, checking ravines, calling Thomas's name into the void. But hope was fading. On the 10th day, Reverend Hargrave held a memorial service for Thomas Calloway. It wasn't a funeral, because there was no body. It was just a prayer, an attempt to give the community some kind of closure. Elizabeth attended with her children. She held Mary's hand throughout the ceremony. Peter, the youngest, didn't understand what was happening. He just asked in a low voice when his father would return. Elizabeth didn't know what to say, and then, on the morning of the 13th day, Thomas appeared. It was Joseph Harlan, the grocery store owner, who saw him first. He opened the store door around 6 in the morning and froze. Thomas was standing in the middle of the street, about 20 meters away in front of the church, barefoot. His clothes torn, stained with dirt and dry leaves, his face covered with an uneven beard of almost 2 weeks. But what caught Joseph's attention most were his eyes. He later described them as eyes that had seen something they shouldn't have seen. Thomas didn't move. He just stood there staring into nothingness. Joseph called out to him. Thomas didn't respond. Joseph approached slowly, cautiously, as if dealing with a wounded animal. "Thomas? Thomas, is that you?" Thomas blinked slowly, then turned his head toward Joseph. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Joseph touched his shoulder. Thomas flinched but didn't pull away. "Are you okay? Where have you been?" Thomas opened his mouth as if to answer, but then looked away and simply started walking. Not toward his home, not toward any specific place, just walking slowly like a sleepwalker. The news spread quickly. Within minutes, dozens of people were in the streets. Elizabeth ran to him, her eyes wide, her face pale. She hugged him, held him tight, cried against his chest. Thomas did not return the embrace. He just stood there, arms at his sides, staring at some distant point that no one else could see. "Thomas, for God's sake, where have you been? What happened?" Elizabeth pleaded, holding his face with both hands. Thomas looked at her, and for the first time his eyes seemed to focus on something real. He opened his mouth, and he said, in a hoarse, broken, almost inaudible voice, "I can't talk about it." Thomas Calloway was taken home. Elizabeth guided him by the hand, as if guiding a child. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just followed, putting one foot in front of the other, his eyes fixed on the ground. People watched from windows, balconies, backyards. No one came too close. There was something about him that kept everyone at a distance. Something that wasn't fear, but involuntary respect in the face of something incomprehensible. When they got home, Elizabeth prepared hot water and tried to clean his wounds. There were scratches on his arms, superficial cuts on his legs, calluses on the soles of his bare feet. Nothing serious. Nothing that suggested a struggle or desperate flight. Just the marks of someone who had walked a long way, for a long time, on uneven ground. Elizabeth asked again where he had been. Thomas looked away. She insisted, her voice trembling. He shook his head. "I can't," was all he said. Dr. Samuel Porter, the only doctor in the area, was called that same afternoon. He examined Thomas for over an hour. He measured his heart rate. He checked his reflexes. He looked at his throat, his eyes, his pupils. He asked if he was in pain. Thomas said no. He asked if he remembered what had happened. Thomas remained silent. "Doctor," Porter wrote in his report, "patient is in stable physical condition considering the circumstances. No signs of fever, infection, or severe malnutrition. However, there is something disturbing about his mental state. He is present, but absent. He responds to stimuli, but seems to be somewhere else. I recommend rest and constant observation. In the days that followed, Thomas remained at home. He ate when Elizabeth put food in front of him. He drank when she offered him water. He slept when night fell. But he didn't speak. He didn't interact with his children. He didn't look out the window. Mary tried to approach her father a few times, but he just stared at her with a blank expression, as if he were looking through her. Peter was afraid. He hid behind his mother whenever his father entered the room. Reverend Hargrave visited in the second week. He sat next to Thomas in the living room with the Bible on his lap and tried to talk to him. "My son, God hears all confessions. No sin is too great. No secret is too heavy. If you saw something, if you did something, you can tell me. You are not alone." Thomas looked at him for the first time. The Reverend felt a chill run down his spine. "Reverend," Thomas said, his voice low but firm, "what I saw has nothing to do with God, and it has nothing to do with sin. It's something I shouldn't know, and if I tell you, you'll know too, and that can't happen." Reverend Hargrave left the house disturbed. He wrote in his diary that night, "There is something about Thomas Calloway that frightens me deeply. It's not madness, it's not guilt, it's certainty. He knows something, and he believes with every fiber of his being that this knowledge is dangerous." Rumors began to circulate. Some people said Thomas had found something in the woods, something ancient, something buried. Others said he had seen someone who shouldn't have been there. There were those who whispered that Thomas had made a pact, that he had sold his soul in exchange for something. But these were fantasies, superstitions of frightened people trying to name the inexplicable. Margaret Hale, however, had a different theory. She believed that Thomas had discovered something about Ashford Hollow, something that the village hid, perhaps unconsciously. She never said this publicly, but she told a niece years later, that village always had something strange about it. People didn't like to talk about the past, about who had lived there before, about what happened in the forest. Thomas was curious. Maybe he went too deep. Maybe he found a truth the village didn't want to know. 3 months after his return, Thomas went back to work. He picked up his tools and resumed his carpentry services. But something had changed. He worked in absolute silence. He didn't talk to customers. He didn't joke with the other men. He just worked, methodically, precisely, like a machine. Jonathan Frost ordered another door. Thomas delivered it on time. It was perfect. But Jonathan reported that when he received it, he felt an inexplicable discomfort. It was as if the door had been made by someone who was no longer alive, even though he was right there in front of me. Elizabeth tried to rebuild her life. She took care of the children, kept the house, pretended everything was normal. But in her diary she wrote, "I lost my husband 3 months ago. He came back, but he's not him anymore. I sleep next to a stranger who has the face of the man I loved." A year later, Thomas had a brief relapse. He woke up in the middle of the night screaming. Elizabeth rushed to the bedroom and found him sitting on the bed, sweating, shaking, his eyes wide. She held his hands and asked what had happened. Thomas looked at her, and for the first time since he had returned, there were tears in his eyes. "I came back," he said, his voice breaking, "but I shouldn't have come back. I should have stayed there." Elizabeth didn't understand. "Stayed where, Thomas? Where have you been?" Thomas shook his head. "I can't say, but it was a mistake to come back, because now I know I'm trapped, and there's no way out." He never mentioned it again. The years passed. Thomas continued to work. He continued to live, but he was never the same again. He aged rapidly. At 40, he looked 60. His hair turned completely white. His hands trembled when they weren't holding a tool. He developed the habit of constantly looking over his shoulder, as if he were being followed. Elizabeth noticed. The children noticed. But no one talked about it. In 1912, 15 years after the disappearance, Thomas Calloway died. It was a peaceful death. In his sleep, he was 47 years old. Elizabeth found him in the morning, lying in bed, his eyes closed and a serene expression on his face. It was the first time since he had returned that she had seen him truly at peace. In the pocket of the coat he had worn the day before, Elizabeth found a folded piece of paper. She opened it and read it. There was only one sentence, written in Thomas's shaky handwriting. They were right. I shouldn't have come back. Elizabeth burned the paper that same night. She never told anyone what was written on it, but she kept the secret until her own death 30 years later. And when Mary, her eldest daughter, found her mother's diary in the attic, she read everything, and then she kept the secret too. Ashford Hollow no longer exists. At least not in the form it existed in 1897. The village was slowly abandoned over the following decades. Families moved away. Houses were left behind, swallowed up by the forest that had always been there, waiting. Today, all that remains are moss-covered stone foundations, fallen fences, and the skeleton of an old church without a roof. The road that connected the village to the rest of the world is overgrown with vegetation. It is almost impossible to find without an old map. And even with one, few venture there. The records of the Thomas Calloway case are archived in the Clearfield County Library in Pennsylvania. There are 3 boxes of yellowed documents, handwritten statements, letters, and a small diary. Few people have consulted this material over the years. Local historians mention the case briefly in books about 19th century rural communities, but always with caution, as if there was something in those papers that should not be touched. I found these files by chance. I was researching unexplained disappearances in the Appalachian region when the name Thomas Calloway came up. At first, it seemed like just another case of someone who got lost in the woods and was lucky to survive. But the more I read, the more I realized that there was something different, something that the official records couldn't capture, something that was between the lines, in the silences, in the sentences that people didn't finish. I spoke with descendants of the families who lived in Ashford Hollow. Most didn't want to talk. Some said they didn't know anything. Others quickly changed the subject. But one woman, Margaret Hale's great-granddaughter, welcomed me into her home and told me something her grandmother had told her when she was a child. My grandmother always said that Ashford Hollow was a village built on top of something old, something that was there before the houses, before the people, before everything. She said that the surrounding forest was not just a forest, it was a border, and that some people without meaning to crossed that border, and when they crossed it they didn't come back the same. I asked her what she thought Thomas Calloway had found. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. But my grandmother always said that Thomas wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. He was just the only one who came back." There are theories, of course. There always are. Some believe that Thomas suffered some kind of mental breakdown, a nervous breakdown that caused him to wander aimlessly through the forest for almost 2 weeks. That the trauma was so profound that he repressed the memories, creating a psychological barrier that prevented him from talking about what happened. Others suggest that he may have witnessed something criminal, something that put him in danger, and that silence was a form of protection. Some say that he found the remains of something ancient in the forest, perhaps a forgotten cemetery, perhaps traces of native peoples who inhabited the region centuries before, and that this shook him irreversibly. But none of these theories explain everything. None explain Thomas's absolute conviction that the knowledge he carried was dangerous. None explain why he said he shouldn't have come back. None explain the phrase found in his coat pocket on the day of his death. They were right. Who were they? And right about what? I visited the site where Ashford Hollow once stood. It was a long walk, through poorly marked trails and rough terrain. When I finally arrived, the silence was absolute. There were no birds. There was no wind, only the sound of my own footsteps on dry leaves. The ruins were scattered, half hidden by vegetation. Part of the church walls were still standing. I entered cautiously. The floor was covered with debris, rotten wood, pieces of broken glass. In the center, where the altar should have been, there were only piles of stones covered with moss. I stayed there for almost an hour, trying to imagine what it was like when people lived there, trying to feel something that would give me a clue, but I felt nothing, only emptiness. And then, as I was about to leave, I noticed something. A mark on the wall, almost erased by time. They were letters, carved into the stone with some kind of sharp tool. I had to get closer to read them. It simply said, "Don't come back." I don't know who wrote it. I don't know when. But while I was there, alone in that forgotten place, I felt something I can't quite describe. A feeling that I was being watched. Not by someone, but by something. Something ancient, patient, in no hurry. I left quickly, and as I walked back, I looked back just once. The forest was motionless, but I had the strange impression that it had closed behind me, like a door that closes by itself. Thomas Calloway never told anyone what he saw. He took that secret to his grave, and maybe it was better that way, because some things, when known, change who we are irreversibly. Some truths do not set us free. They imprison us. And perhaps Thomas understood this better than any of us could. He survived, but he came back different. He came back knowing something no one else knew. And that knowledge slowly destroyed him, day after day, until there was nothing left but an empty man, waiting for the end. The files remain in the library. The ruins remain in the forest. And the question remains unanswered: what happened during those 13 days? Where was Thomas Calloway? What did he see? What did he learn? No one knows. And perhaps it's better that way, because in the end, some doors should not be opened, some paths should not be followed, and some silences should be respected. Thomas Calloway understood this, and he paid the price.